We all know Vikings as these legendary warriors with their horned helmets and massive axes, right? Wrong. That's Disney Viking stuff compared to the reality. What these people did to women after conquering their enemies makes actual death look like a mercy killing, and I'm not even exaggerating. The historical records barely whisper about it because it was so systematically horrific that even medieval chroniclers, who wrote about beheadings and torture like grocery lists, couldn't bring themselves to document the full truth. But thanks to recent archaeological discoveries and accounts from witnesses like Ibn Fadlan, we now know exactly what happened to the wives, daughters, and mothers of defeated warriors. And I'm telling you right now, this is going to change everything you thought you knew about Viking society. If detailed stories from the Viking world fascinate you, think about subscribing. And let us know too in the comments which city you're listening from. Picture this. It's 845 AD, and the monastery at Cluimacnois has just fallen to Viking raiders. The official records tell us that 43 monks were slaughtered, but here's what they don't tell you. What happened to the women who lived and worked there simply vanishes from history. Poof! Gone. Like they never existed. But here's where it gets absolutely insane. Archaeologists digging at Dublin's Wood Quay didn't find a trading post like everyone expected. They found the remains of a massive slave market specifically designed for processing human beings, like cattle. We're talking iron shackles perfectly sized for women's wrists, tiny ankle rings clearly made for children, and warehouse foundations that could only have been used for one thing: storing human cargo. But wait, it gets worse. Way worse. They found actual price lists carved in runic inscriptions, and I'm not talking about some vague, historical East. Teammates here, these are literal receipts. 20 silver pieces for a young woman, 15 for a mother, 10 if she was injured. These weren't just random numbers either. Archaeologists found these exact prices carved into stone slabs in Schleswig, basically ancient Viking receipts for human trafficking. And here's the part that's going to make your blood run cold. Being sold was considered the lucky outcome. The alternative? Well, buckle up, because we're just getting started. The year is 862 AD, and the Vikings have just massacred the settlement at Port Liege. The Irish annals dutifully record that 47 warriors died in battle, but they mention absolutely nothing about the 53 women who were found at the site. Nothing. Radio silence. But archaeologists examining bog sites near the battlefield found something that'll make you lose sleep. 23 female bodies showing signs of systematic, prolonged violence that happened after they'd already surrendered. I'm talking skull fractures from behind, defensive wounds on their arms, broken ribs from sustained assault over hours or even days. These weren't battlefield deaths. These were slow, methodical executions that happened after the fighting was over, after these women had already been captured and were completely defenseless. And if you think that's an isolated incident, think again. When the Great Heathen Army captured Reading in 871 AD, King Ethelred's defeat was recorded for posterity. Sure, but the royal women who were in the palace? Their fate is completely scrubbed from the records. But the foundation stones of that palace tell a different story. They're stained with blood iron from dozens of people, and chemical analysis shows most of it came from women. The archaeological evidence is screaming what the written records refuse to say. Now here's where this story takes a turn that's going to make you question everything about medieval law and society. The Vikings didn't just randomly assault captured women. They had an entire legal framework for it. I'm not kidding. They had actual laws written down that spelled out exactly how this systematic horror was supposed to work. According to 9th century Icelandic law codes, when a warrior killed another man in battle, that dead man's wife automatically became property, and I mean literally property, of the killer. The legal term was a kona, which translates to own woman, but the real meaning is property that happens to breathe. The process was brutally simple and completely legal. The captor would declare ownership in front of witnesses, and the woman had absolutely no voice in the matter. None. Zero. The children born from what we would call rape were considered completely legitimate under Viking law because, according to their legal system, it wasn't rape, it was a property transaction. The woman was livestock, and livestock doesn't get to consent to anything. But even this legal nightmare had rules that somehow made it worse. The Gragas law codes, and yes, these are real historical documents, specified that a warrior had exactly 3 days to claim a captured woman. And after that deadline, other warriors could challenge his ownership. Picture that for a second. grown men fighting over women like they were disputed territory at a livestock market, while the women themselves had less legal standing than the horses. And if you think forced marriage was the worst thing that could happen to these captured women, you're about to discover how much more creative human cruelty can get. When a great Viking warrior died, his possessions had to be burned with him: horses, weapons, ships, and yes, women. The monastery at Bangor was completely destroyed in 878 AD, and when archaeologists examined the burn layers, they found female bones arranged in specific patterns around what had clearly been funeral pyres. But we don't have to guess about what this looked like because we have an eyewitness account that'll make your stomach turn. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat, witnessed a Viking funeral ceremony on the Volga River in 921 AD, and his description is so disturbing that historians debated for centuries whether he was exaggerating. Spoiler alert, he wasn't. Archaeological evidence from Scandinavian boat burials shows the exact same patterns. Female skeletons found in warrior graves with clear signs of strangulation trauma. But here's the detail that proves this was systematic and planned. Chemical analysis of their teeth shows drug residues, specifically alkaloids from henbane seeds, that cause hallucinations and compliance. They were poisoned to make them easier to handle during the ritual murder. The level of premeditation here is absolutely chilling. These weren't crimes of passion or battlefield frenzy. This was methodical, organized, and considered completely normal by their society. Now let's talk about what happened to the children born from these forced unions, because this is where the story somehow manages to get even darker. At the Viking winter camp in Thetford in 907 AD, the official records mention the usual destruction: cattle slaughtered, churches burned, the standard Viking checklist. But they don't mention what archaeologists found in the refuse pits. Infant bones showing signs of deliberate killing. Not stillbirths, not disease, murder. The skulls show blunt force trauma in a specific pattern that indicates these killings were quick, efficient, and routine. Under Viking law, if your mother was a slave, you were a slave. If your mother was property, you were property. And property that couldn't work was property that needed to be eliminated. It's that simple and that horrific. The bone evidence shows this wasn't emotional or angry violence. It was cold, calculated, business-like elimination of economic liabilities. When the Normans later conquered England, the Domesday Book actually records this practice continuing. And population analysis of Yorkshire villages shows demographic gaps that perfectly match Viking settlement patterns. Entire generations of women who simply vanish from the historical record. The scale of this systematic horror becomes clear when you look at the archaeological evidence from Repton, where the Great Army spent the winter of 873 to 874 AD. They found 249 skeletons in burial chambers. But here's the smoking gun: only 63 of them were female. That ratio is mathematically impossible for a natural population. Isotope analysis of those female bones reveals something even more disturbing. These women came from Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. They were cargo from conquered territories, not Viking women who had died naturally. But those 63 women in the graves, they were the lucky ones who died from disease or childbirth. The rest simply vanished into the slavery networks that stretched from Dublin all the way to Baghdad. Dublin wasn't just a trading post, it was a human processing center where ships arrived weekly with fresh captives who were sorted by age and destination. The young ones went to Norse settlements as breeding stock. The older ones were shipped to Islamic markets, where fair-skinned Celtic and Germanic women commanded premium prices as exotic luxuries. The infrastructure for this human trafficking operation was massive and sophisticated. Dendrochronology, that's tree ring dating, shows that Dublin slave facilities expanded continuously for 60 years, from 841 to 970 AD. The stone warehouses could hold 200 people at a time, and they even built drainage systems specifically for human waste, because they were planning on long-term storage of human beings like grain or cattle. And this wasn't some small-scale local operation. Arabic sources from the 9th century describe Viking slave caravans reaching Baghdad regularly, and runic ship manifests found along the Russian river routes list human cargo right alongside furs and amber. Standard capacity was 20 women per vessel, and these weren't desperate refugees making dangerous journeys. These were systematically organized supply chains feeding international markets. But somehow, and I cannot stress this enough, being sold into slavery wasn't the worst fate these women could face. If a captured woman tried to resist, tried to escape, or heaven forbid, tried to fight back, the punishment was specifically designed to be worse than death. When Irish forces retook Dublin in 914 AD, they found execution grounds outside the city walls that featured stone-lined pits designed for prolonged dying. These pits were exactly 6 feet deep and 3 feet wide, too narrow to lie down, too shallow to stand up straight. Women with broken legs to prevent escape and broken arms to prevent self-harm were lowered into these holes where they would crouch in agony for days or weeks until thirst or exposure finally killed them. The legal framework even covered this torture. According to Viking slave law, killing or injuring your master earned you live burial, but not the quick kind. The pits were shallow enough to allow air, but deep enough to prevent escape, and soil analysis shows that decomposition in these pits took weeks. Some pits had sharp stones at the bottom, others had standing water that would slowly rise with rain. The entire system was designed not just for killing, but for public suffering that would serve as a lesson to other captives. As Viking military expansion slowed and civil wars ended with Harold Fairhair's consolidation in 919 AD, you might think this systematic horror would decrease. Wrong again. Peace didn't stop the trafficking. It industrialized it. Established routes meant predictable supply chains and delivery schedules. The Rus-Byzantine Treaty of 944 AD actually lists slave prices by category in official diplomatic documents. Young women commanded premiums. Pregnant women were discounted. Children under 10 were considered nearly worthless. When archaeologists examined the baggage train from the Battle of Brunanburh in 937 AD, the last major Viking raid on Irish territory, they found portable breeding pens, iron frameworks designed specifically for transporting human cargo, and modular slave markets that could be assembled into compounds for long-term captivity and then disassembled for movement. Each pen could hold 12 adults or 20 children, with iron anchor rings for securing chains. This wasn't primitive raiding. It was sophisticated logistics for industrial-scale human trafficking. But here's where this story takes its most twisted turn yet. When Viking power finally collapsed and Eric Bloodaxe died in 954 AD, marking the end of the last Viking kingdom, the infrastructure for systematic sexual exploitation didn't disappear. It was inherited by Christian kingdoms, who simply rebranded the operation. Monastery records start using terms like indentured servants instead of slaves, but the women who had been captured by Vikings were now serving Christian masters under new terminology that meant exactly the same thing. The archaeological evidence shows that when Viking power collapsed, there was a massive elimination campaign. Women who could testify about the systematic violence they'd experienced had to die because they were witnesses to crimes that the new Christian read. Rulers wanted to pretend had never happened. The Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 might have ended the Viking Age in England, but it began the systematic erasure of evidence. And here's the revelation that's going to absolutely destroy your faith in humanity. The most recent archaeological discovery at Repton shows that Vikings were so aware of how horrific their treatment of captured women was that when their own power collapsed and English forces pushed back, they applied the exact same methods to their own families. A mass grave sealed in 986 AD contained 236 individuals, all female, all genetically Norse, not captives, who had been systematically executed by their own people using the same methods they had used on their victims. The soil cores show these killings happened over several days in a planned elimination campaign. Viking families killed their own women to prevent them from being captured and experiencing the same systematic horror they had inflicted on others for generations. And carved into the skull of one victim, a girl aged 12 to 14 who had been born in Norway and brought to England only to be killed by her own people, is a runic inscription that says simply, "Better this way." That inscription was carved post-mortem after her death as a justification for family murder. The ultimate horror isn't just what Vikings did to their captives, it's that they knew exactly how awful their system was because they created it, and when faced with the possibility that their own women might experience it, they chose murder instead. The legal codification of this systematic violence is preserved in the Gragas codes, which detail exactly how claiming women was supposed to work. The captor had to announce his claim with 3 witnesses minimum. The woman's resistance was legally meaningless, and if she committed suicide to escape, her family owed compensation to the captor for destruction of property. 40 silver marks, more than most men earned in a year. When King Athelred issued his decree in 978 AD addressing Viking slave trading, he wasn't trying to stop it, he was trying to tax it. 5 silver per woman, 2 per child in customs duties. The English response to systematic sexual violence wasn't horror, but jealousy of the prophets. The archaeological evidence shows purpose-built slave ships with specialized cargo holds and ventilation systems designed for human transport. The largest vessel archaeologists have found could transport 80 people, and when it burned at sea, all cargo was lost, including the human beings chained in the hold. But the most haunting evidence of resistance comes from the story of Gunhild, a Norse captive who became a Frankish raid leader and spent 7 years from 923 to 930 AD hunting Vikings with intimate knowledge of their methods and weaknesses. She destroyed 12 Viking camps and freed over 300 captives using surprise attacks that showed no mercy to her former captors. Archaeological evidence from Seine River sites shows burn layers from this period that suggest someone was systematically hunting Vikings with their own methods turned against them. When the Normans conquered England in 1066, they didn't abandon these practices, they refined them. Domesday Book entries list women alongside livestock and grain as property that came with land grants. Castle courtyards included cells specifically built for holding women, with capacity for 30 people at a time. The infant mortality rate for children of forced unions was near 100%, not from neglect, but from deliberate elimination. Modern DNA evidence confirms the scale of systematic rape that the historical records tried to hide. Iceland shows 60% Celtic female lineage. Norway shows 40% British Isles female ancestry, genetic trails that follow slave routes exactly and represent thousands of captured women forced into pregnancies whose children never knew their mother's names. The most damning archaeological discovery is the Jorvik breeding facility in York, a previously unknown building from 876 AD with 64 individual cells, chains anchored to stone walls, and evidence of continuous operation for 40 years. Church records document 732 births, with only 12 children surviving past age 5, and the church sold those survivors as servants, using the profits to fund construction projects in active business partnership with the Viking operators. The final evidence comes from soil analysis at Repton, showing multiple burial episodes spanning 50 years. Not one massacre, but ongoing elimination across generations. Chemical analysis reveals mercury poisoning causing madness before death, perfectly designed to destroy the credibility of potential witnesses along with their lives. The women eliminated weren't chosen randomly. They were selected based on knowledge. Interpreters, facility managers, anyone who had served as translators or administrators were specifically targeted because they could testify about the systematic nature of the violence. And even in death, even as victims of their own families who chose murder over letting them live to potentially experience capture, Viking women had the same fate as their captives. No voice, no choice, and no escape from a system so horrific that death truly was considered the merciful option. The runic inscription, "Better this way," appears repeatedly in these final elimination sites. The last message from a civilization that understood exactly what they had created because they had spent generations perfecting systematic sexual violence as both weapon and industry. This is the untold history that medieval chroniclers couldn't bring themselves to document fully, the archaeological truth that reveals systematic horrors hidden behind heroic sagas, and the genetic evidence that proves the scale of suffering that official records tried to erase from history forever.